Listen to me, ladies. The moment you stop reaching out, something surprising happens. And no, it's not because you're playing games, and it's not because you're trying to manipulate him. It's because the silence reveals things that all that constant communication hides. And what he notices in that silence might just completely change the way he looks at you. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly what a man notices when you don't reach out, and why this has less to do with making him chase you and everything to do with understanding how men think, human psychology, attraction, and knowing your own worth. Because the biggest thing he notices isn't what most women think it is. Have you ever stopped texting a man first and suddenly noticed a shift in his behavior? Maybe he started reaching out more. Maybe he pulled back. Or maybe he showed you exactly where you stand. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever learned something crucial about a man just by stepping back? Because what we're talking about today isn't about withholding love. It's about discovering what becomes clear when you stop doing all the heavy lifting. Now, one of the first things a man notices when you don't reach out is the change in energy. Listen, human beings adapt quickly. When a woman is consistently initiating conversations, checking in, and keeping the spark alive, a man gets used to it. He expects it. So when that pattern changes, it wakes him up. Suddenly, the rhythm feels different. The silence isn't necessarily painful, but it's noticeable. And what makes it noticeable is that he becomes aware of something he was taking for granted. Not you, but the effort you were putting in. That's a big distinction, because effort only becomes visible when it's gone. The second thing he notices is whether he feels motivated to bridge that gap himself. This is where a lot of y'all misunderstand attraction. Attraction isn't just about how much a man likes you. It's about whether he's willing to invest. When you stop reaching out, you're creating space for him to decide what he wants to do with that space. Will he step up? Will he stay put? Will he make an effort? The answer tells you something valuable. Not about your worth, but about his level of investment. And that's information you need to have. The third thing he notices is your independence. Look, confidence isn't loudly announcing that you don't need nobody. Confidence is quietly showing that your happiness doesn't depend on a man's attention. When you keep living your life, chasing your goals, enjoying your friends, and holding your standards, you communicate something powerful. You show him that your life is already full. And healthy relationships are built when two whole people choose to share their lives, not when one person becomes the whole world for the other. That kind of independence is deeply attractive to a man, not because it's a mystery, but because it's real. Now, if you're getting value out of this so far, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you've ever figured out a man's true level of interest just by taking a step back, drop your story in the comments. Your experience might help another woman get some clarity in her own relationship. The fourth thing he notices is how much of the connection was being carried by you. Sometimes we don't realize how much work one person is doing until that work stops. The conversations get shorter, the momentum slows down, the vibe changes, and suddenly it's obvious who was doing all the driving. Now, this isn't about pointing fingers. Relationships work when both people contribute. But awareness is powerful, because once you see the reality of the dynamic, you can make better decisions about where to spend your time and energy. The fifth thing he notices is how he actually feels. Distance has a way of bringing clarity. When a woman is always available, it's easy for a man to just go on autopilot. But when there's space, he starts to think. He might realize he misses talking to you. He might realize he enjoys your presence more than he gave himself credit for. Or he might realize he wasn't as invested as he pretended to be. Whatever the outcome, clarity is always better than confusion, because clarity lets both people move forward with the truth. And finally, here's what men notice most when you don't reach out. They notice your self-respect, not because you're ignoring him, not because you're trying to teach him a lesson, but because you're showing him that relationships require mutual effort. Self-respect says, I care about you. I enjoy talking to you, but I am not going to carry this whole relationship by myself. That's not arrogance. That's emotional maturity. And emotionally mature people understand something important. Healthy relationships are built on reciprocity. Both people showing up, both people investing, both people choosing each other. So if you're wondering what a man notices when you don't reach out, remember this. He notices the change in energy. He notices the space you created. He notices whether he wants to step up. He notices your independence. He notices his own feelings. And above all, he notices the standards you have for how you deserve to be treated. The goal was never to make a man chase you. The goal was always to stop chasing a man who isn't meeting you halfway. Because the strongest relationships aren't built on pursuit. They're built on mutual effort, mutual respect, and mutual choice. And when two people willingly choose each other over and over again, that's where real connection begins. Now, let me break this down a little more, because one of the first things a man notices when you stop reaching out is the shift in the rhythm between y'all. Human connection is built on patterns, and most folks don't think about those patterns until they break. When you've been the one starting the conversations, checking in, sending the texts, and keeping things alive, you created a flow. Over time, that flow becomes normal to him. It becomes automatic. Not because he doesn't care, but because the male brain adapts to consistency. We stop noticing what's predictable. So when you suddenly step back and stop reaching out, that predictability vanishes, and the absence wakes him up. It's like how you don't notice the hum of the refrigerator until it turns off. In that silence, something subtle happens in his mind. He realizes the connection doesn't feel the same, even if he can't put his finger on why right away. There's a gap between what she expected and what's actually happening. And that gap is what grabs his attention. He might not jump up and act right this second, but internally, he's registering the change. The conversation that used to be easy now requires him to put in effort if he wants it to keep going. And effort is the magic word here, because effort forces a man to pay attention. When something requires him to act instead of just react, he starts evaluating it differently. He might start to realize that you were the one keeping the momentum going. That realization doesn't always hit him like a ton of bricks. Sometimes it's just a quiet thought, like she hasn't texted today, or I haven't heard from her in a minute. But when that thought repeats, it builds a sense of distance. This distance doesn't automatically mean he's losing interest, but it does make him reflect. And reflection is where his perception shifts. He might start questioning the dynamic without even calling it a problem. The change in your availability highlights your presence in a way constant contact never could. In a weird way, your absence makes your role more visible than your presence ever did. He starts to understand the value of the effort you were putting in, not because you demanded a thank you, but because taking it away showed him what it was doing. When you stop reaching out, one of the deeper shifts that happens in a man's mind is that he starts questioning where he actually stands in your life. This isn't always some dramatic, conscious thought like, do I matter to her? Instead, it usually starts as a quiet curiosity triggered by the change. Men rely heavily on signals to understand where they stand, and consistent communication is one of the loudest signals. When that signal suddenly goes quiet, his brain naturally tries to fill in the blanks. If he was used to you initiating contact, there was an unspoken assumption that you were emotionally available and highly interested. So when that pattern changes, it messes with his internal map of the relationship. He might start wondering if something shifted emotionally on your end, if your priorities changed, or if he's no longer occupying the same space in your head that he used to. This isn't necessarily a bad insecurity. It's just his brain trying to restore clarity when the familiar cues are gone. What makes this powerful is that it forces him to evaluate his own level of investment. Because when communication is constant and easy, there's no need to think about importance. But when you step back, effort is required to keep the connection at the same level, and effort naturally leads to comparison. He might start noticing whether he's doing as much as he thought he was, or if the dynamic has been more one-sided than he realized. In that moment, your absence becomes a mirror, reflecting his own behavior back at him. He might also interpret your silence in different ways, depending on his emotional maturity and how interested he really is. If he's invested, he'll see it as space, not rejection, and feel motivated to re-engage. If he's uncertain or not that invested, he might not prioritize closing the gap quickly, but he will still register the shift. Either way, your position in his mental hierarchy of priorities gets clearer. You move from being an automatic presence to someone whose absence requires thought. This process is crucial because it reveals the truth without forcing it. It doesn't rely on a long explanation or a confrontation. It simply changes the dynamic enough that he has to internally reassess where you fit in his life and whether he's willing to act to keep that connection or just let the distance stay. And let me tell you, one of the most important things that happens when you stop reaching out is that space is created. And in that space, a man begins to feel the emotional weight of your absence. In everyday interactions, presence often goes unnoticed because it just blends into the routine. When a woman is consistently available, she becomes part of the background of his life. But when that presence is suddenly pulled back, even just a little bit, the contrast jumps out. The mind is wired to detect change a lot stronger than consistency, which is why absence often speaks louder than presence. At first, he might not feel it emotionally. It might just start as something simple, like noticing fewer notifications, fewer texts, or a break in the usual rhythm. But over time, that small gap starts to create an emotional echo. He becomes aware that there's a space where interaction used to be. And that space doesn't stay neutral for long. The human mind naturally tries to assign meaning to absence, especially when it comes from someone who was previously consistent. What happens next depends on his level of attachment, but in a lot of cases, the absence starts to spark curiosity and reflection. He might replay past interactions in his head, not because he's forced to, but because the silence gives his thoughts room to roam. He might remember conversations more clearly, moments of connection, or just the ease that existed when the communication was flowing. This is where emotional awareness starts to grow because contrast reveals value. The interesting part is that emotional space doesn't just make a man miss you. It also makes him more aware of the role you were playing in his emotional life. When you were actively reaching out, you were part of his routine. But when you stop, he begins to feel the difference between having that emotional touch point and not having it. That difference is what creates that sense of missing you, even if he doesn't immediately put a label on it. Space also removes the emotional noise. Without constant interaction, there are fewer distractions, and that allows deeper feelings to come to the surface. He might start to notice whether he feels a pull to reconnect or if the absence just feels neutral over time. Either reaction gives him clarity about how much emotional weight the connection actually held for him. In a lot of cases, what feels like just silence from your end becomes a subtle emotional signal on his end. It highlights what was meaningful, what was taken for granted, and what now feels missing in his daily life. And that awareness often shapes whether he chooses to step up or just let the distance grow naturally over time. Now, one of the most revealing things that happens when you stop reaching out is that a man begins to see, often for the very first time, the actual structure of effort inside the connection. When communication is flowing regularly, it's real easy for both people to assume things are mutual. Messages come in, conversations happen, and there's a shared sense of connection. But what often goes completely unnoticed is who is actually initiating, who is keeping the momentum going, and who is carrying the responsibility of keeping things alive. When you were consistently reaching out, you were adding movement to the relationship without it ever being questioned. Once you stop, that movement doesn't just slow down, it exposes the underlying pattern. If he was relying on your initiative, even subconsciously, he now has to decide whether he wants to keep the interaction going on his own. This shift is huge because it turns something passive into something active. Instead of just responding to you, he now has to generate the connection himself. And when that happens, his awareness naturally goes up. He starts to notice how often he was just reacting instead of initiating, or how comfortable he had gotten with you doing all the emotional heavy lifting. This realization doesn't always hit him in some dramatic, tearful moment. It often builds quietly through small comparisons. He might notice that conversations aren't just starting themselves anymore. He might feel a slight hesitation before reaching out, simply because the automatic rhythm got disrupted. In that disruption, the truth about effort becomes visible. What once felt like a smooth exchange now requires intention, and intention reveals value. He might also start to reflect on the consistency you brought to the dynamic. Consistency is something folks rarely appreciate fully while it's there. It just becomes part of the background. But when it's removed, its importance becomes crystal clear. He might recognize that you were often the one keeping the connection warm, checking in, or creating reasons to talk. And in that recognition, there's a subtle recalibration of how he views your role in the connection. This is where emotional awareness and behavioral awareness start to overlap. He not only notices the absence of your texts, but also the absence of the energy you were contributing. And that absence highlights the contrast. It shows him what effort looks like when it's no longer being provided on autopilot. In a lot of cases, this realization leads to a choice point. Either he decides to step into the space you were holding, or he becomes more passive now that the structure is gone. Either way, what becomes clear is that the connection was being sustained in a way he might not have fully acknowledged before. And that clarity can significantly influence how he values the dynamic moving forward, whether he chooses to invest more intentionally or let distance define the new normal. When you stop reaching out, one of the deeper shifts that can happen is that a man is forced into a quieter kind of emotional reflection, where he starts to notice how he actually feels without the constant stimulation of interaction. In ongoing communication, feelings can stay pretty surface level because there's always something happening next. A text comes in, a reply goes out, the conversation keeps rolling, and the emotional system stays engaged in motion. But when that motion slows down, something different happens. The mind has more space, and in that space, feelings become a lot more noticeable. At first, this might just feel like a simple awareness of absence. He notices you haven't texted, or the usual rhythm has changed. But over time, that absence starts to interact with his memory and emotional associations. He might start to recall how he felt during conversations with you, not in a forced way, but because the brain naturally pulls up emotionally relevant experiences when external input drops. Moments that once felt casual can start to carry more weight in hindsight simply because they aren't being replaced by new interactions. This is where clarity starts to form. Without constant contact, he's no longer just reacting to you in real time. So he starts reacting to the idea of you. And that shift is important because it allows him to evaluate the emotional impact you actually had on him. He might begin to realize that he enjoyed your presence more than he consciously admitted, or that your communication added something to his daily emotional life that is now missing. On the flip side, this space can also reveal neutrality. If his feelings aren't strongly invested, the absence might just feel like a quiet gap that doesn't create any urgency. That contrast is also valuable because it removes the confusion. It shows whether the connection was emotionally significant or just situational. Either way, what he feels becomes a lot more honest because it isn't being shaped by immediate interaction. Another important layer is that absence often removes emotional distraction. When someone is present, attention is divided between responding and reflecting. When they're absent, reflection takes over more fully. He might start to ask himself, even if it's just subtly, whether he misses the connection or if he's just noticing the change in his routine. That distinction matters because missing someone emotionally and missing a habit can feel similar at first, but they lead to very different responses. Over time, this process creates emotional clarity. He becomes more aware of whether there's genuine attachment, curiosity, or just indifference. And that awareness is powerful because it isn't forced by a conversation or pressure. It's revealed naturally through distance and internal reflection that emerges when the external noise is turned down and his true feelings have the space to surface and settle on their own. And finally, when you stop reaching out, one of the most important things a man notices is your self-respect. And this is often the part that has the deepest long-term impact. Not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it changes the way he perceives your value in a quiet, internal way. Self-respect isn't about ignoring a man to get a reaction, and it isn't about withdrawing your affection to punish him or control the situation. It's simply the point where your behavior starts